Good morning, everybody. Happy to have so many of you here. So we started that. This is a song by a gentleman named Ted Slowick, who is himself a reporter. And it's sort of representative of, I think, like my journey and the museum's journey with this case. Molly is larger than life. She has become a folk hero, hence the folk song. I've described it as a meme in some ways in Joliet. But at the end of the day, this is a critically important story, and I don't think it's going too far to say to democracy. Molly was one of only 3 reporters who was cited as predictably being killed in the line of duty. One of those other reporters was Jake Lingle, who was very mobbed up with the Capone mob. And the other was Elijah Lovejoy, who was crusading against slavery and was killed for that. And you had Molly, certainly, has the crusading journalist aspect, but one of my favorite things in kind of getting to know her through research is that, forgive the term, but she was a badass. I mean, she was staking political candidates. She was weaponizing the Spectator. She was fearless, and this is an era where women weren't supposed to do that. So I've really come to admire her. I've really come to personally think that justice needs to be done, that someone somewhere knows something, that we need to find out what that something is, that we need closure. Molly had a large family. Molly still has a family. Some of those family members are here with us today. So we are keeping this going. It started for me as just this cool story about Joliet, and it became more and more personal the more and more I learned about it. So thank you for being with us to help us do that and bring some closure and kind of keep this going and keep this at the forefront and keep talking about it. That's how I think something will happen if we keep talking about it, if we keep meeting like this, if we keep challenging ourselves. I can tell you that, Lonnie and I were kind of like, well, a couple weeks ago, like, it's the 65th, we have to do something. We have to do something. So thank you all for the support. My name is Greg, by the way. I'm the director of the museum. I forgot to introduce my title. But really, I want to introduce our featured presenter today, and there's certainly some special people who are with us today that we want to introduce you to as well. Lonnie Kane. So Lonnie, a man who needs no introduction in this town. So sharing new information today about the Molly Zelko mystery is Lonnie, who was the managing editor of the daily newspaper in Ottawa for 30 years. He quote-unquote retired in 2014. The Molly story has been part of Lonnie's life since 1978 when he was a reporter for the Joliet Herald News covering City Hall. He was pulled into the story by fellow reporter and columnist John Whiteside. Together they produced a series of articles on Molly that ran over 13 days plus follow-up reaction stories. Their lead story that hit the streets on Sunday, September 24th, 1978 ran under this headline, quote, "Is Molly buried on Stryker? Witness breaks 21 years silence." Lonnie worked at the Herald News in the 70s. That is the actual paper. Ending up in Ottawa. John Whiteside stayed at the Herald News until he passed away in 2005. John kept the Molly story alive through more feature packages and with his popular column. John did this until he passed in 2005. John and Lonnie never stopped digging for details related to the Molly mystery and never stopped hoping they'd be able to answer that question. Is Molly buried on Stryker? Today, Lonnie will share what he has learned since 1978 that might help us answer that question. So without further ado, Lonnie Kane.
I'll try holding it. Okay, is it on? You can hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay. Good morning. Good morning. I'm going to try and relax. There's a lot of people here. I guess that shows that the Molly story is still alive and breathing, which has been my goal for a long time, well, since 1978. Before I get into the presentation I had prepared for today in a week, and I want to introduce some people here today. I want to begin with Jim Zelko. Jim, if you'd like to stand. Jim is Molly Zelko's nephew, still living in the Joliet area. He is the former retired executive director of the health department. Some of you may remember him from back then. Jim also brought the fur coat for us for display. And I've asked him to introduce the Zelko family members that are here today.
first thing I'd like to say is that on the way over here, I told my family, I said, you know, if we have more than 10 people there, I would be thrilled. And I'm overwhelmed by the response. I saw a little blurb in the Herald News. I don't know what these folks did to advertise it, but I am so grateful that there is such an interest still after all these years in Molly and her bravery and her story. I thank you and I salute you all for being here. There are several Zelkos here. There may be more in the audience that I don't know, but my cousin Ron, his wife Linda, and daughter Amanda. And sitting behind my family, who I will introduce after, are some Zelkos that I met for the first time today. You think of Zelko as a name that, who's that? But if you just introduce yourself and those with you, please.
My name is Karen Zelko. She was a cousin to my husband, my daughter Jennifer, and my son Trent Zelko.
And my family is here, my wife Rita, and believe it or not, my daughter Molly is here. I'm gonna take a minute that I didn't tell Ani about, but when I was director of the health department, we had a event over a weekend, and that event took place the day after we got back from China and adopted Molly, our daughter. And at the event was an individual named Marks Gibson. And I'm sure Lonnie knows and remembers Marks very well. He was the editor-in-chief.
City editor.
City editor of the Herald News. And he and his staff were working on all of these Molly stories. And he was there, and we were there with Molly, who at the time was 14 months old. And I went up to Marks and I said, Marks, on Monday morning, when you see John Whiteside, you tell him that you met Molly Zelko at Bicentennial Park over the weekend. I would love to have been at that meeting to see John's reaction, but anyhow, that's all.
Thank you, Jim. I can tell you sat through that story like 1,000 times. I saw it on your face. Well, welcome.
I embarrassed Molly.
Yeah. Well, we're thrilled to have the family members here, and thank you for being here, and thank you for kind of trusting us with this story and to keep this going again for the reasons I alluded to earlier. So we'll hand it back over to Lonnie.
If you want to hold that nice and close and kind of point it that way, we'll get more volume.
Okay, I need to make one thing very, very clear from the very beginning. You've heard his name mentioned already a few times. All the information that I have that I'm going to share today began in 1978, and the research has continued. But the story about Molly Zelko is living and breathing to this very day because of one person. That gentleman is John Whiteside. He was a very close friend. And I think many people in this room probably remember him much better than they remember me. I want to take a moment to introduce his wife, Mary Jane Whiteside. And I should point out that in many years, Mary Jane had to recognize and understand that Molly Zelko was part of her family. Lived and breathed in her house, whether she was not here or not, because John was truly obsessed with this story. And it's because for both of us, it became a story of a lifetime as far as reporters go. And it's truly an important story to Joliet. Much of the Molly story is out there, the basics. I'm kind of going into today assuming that most of you know most of those basics, but just as an FYI, I have a Facebook page. If you go on Facebook and do a search for Molly Zelko or the search for Molly Zelko, you'll find it. There's some interesting stuff on there, a lot. None of what I'm going to tell you today is on there yet. Also, the museum has done a podcast that I participated in, and then a follow-up Zoom webinar, and we covered a lot of the basic Molly Zelko story in that. If you can get your hands on a Chicago Reader, several years ago did a very good summary of the case, and the library in town, the Joliet Library, has a Molly Zelko file full of many clips. In fact, I think the Reader article is in that file. And today, this is being filmed Channel 6, I believe, and it will be made available through YouTube. And I believe they're doing a Zoom of this also, which I assume on the website or the Facebook page for the museum, they'll share that, so as will I when I get it. So there's the basic information on the Molly story is out there for those that feel like they're in the dark. I have a lot of new information that has never been in print. I've shared it with family and friends, but I think it's time that the public, especially the Joliet public, know what I know and maybe help me decide whether it matters. That's the big question. So let me set the stage. September 24th, 1978, Sunday morning. Early for me because I was sleeping in, something I liked to do back in the day when I was working. The phone next to my head rang, and it was early morning, and it jerked me out of my sleep. I grabbed it and kind of mumbled hello. I wasn't awake. I don't wake up fast. And there was a gentleman, a man, on the line, and he just began saying, is this Lonnie Kane? Do you know what you've done? Do you know what you've done? He was not angry. He was afraid. He was nervous. And I knew immediately what he was talking about. That was the day that our series ran on Molly Zelko, that Sunday, and our lead article began that day. So this man was reacting to that article. And I'm saying this kind of sets the stage for part of what I'm going to talk about today. And that's the fact that this was 21 years after Molly disappeared that those articles ran. And this gentleman who was calling me, who did not give me a name, was afraid. And fear was a major factor in the 6 months that John and I worked on this story. Everybody we talked to was afraid to talk. Many of them wouldn't talk on the record. After the series ran, we got tons of letters and phone calls, all anonymous. They were afraid. The fear factor was dominant 21 years after. So, the fear factor is strong, and his question was, what have you done? And I knew that I wanted to keep him on the line, and so I tried to get out of bed and find something to write on, but he hung up. His message was clear. We apparently had touched a nerve with this article about a witness. So the story about the witness, this story, used an anonymous name. We protected the identity of the witness. Today I'm going to tell you who it was and how we found her. It starts with the shoes. They're over there. Hope you get a chance to look at them. Size 6.5, 7, I think. The shoes were held by Joe Trisna. Joe Trisna was the Will County Sheriff in 1978 when we did our series. He was chief of police in 1957. He had been chief for a little less than a year, so he was a rookie as chief. He had kept the shoes in his home over all those years in a brown paper sack with the evidence tag attached. He told us that he just couldn't let go of them, and he didn't want to leave them at the police department. There were a lot of reports that disappeared in the Joliet Police Department. So he took them with him, and he kept them, and he gave them to John. It was like being handed a direct connection to Molly, a piece of Molly. Whenever John and I were working together and writing together, the shoes were there. We kept the shoes near us. It was like a touchstone. They still are. I keep them near me. When I'm working on Molly stuff, I'm working on a book. So the shoes, we get the shoes, and then one day I open up the Herald News and I see that there's going to be a psychic fair in Manuka. So I clip out the little promo ad in the newspaper and I take it over to John. I say, John, we got to go to the psychic fair. We got to take the shoes. Now I'm not saying that I was a big believer in psychics. And to be perfectly honest, when John and I started playing around with psychics and we took those shoes to that fair, it was all about getting a fun story. Let's see what they say. It was copy about Molly. So we take the shoes to the psychic fair, and there were several psychics there, and we gave them the shoes. To this day, I'm thinking some of those psychics knew who the shoes belonged to ahead of time because we had been in contact with the person who was setting up the fair, and I think she might have shared it, but it doesn't matter. The psychics held the shoes, and of course they told us about the danger, the darkness. This woman was in peril. She had information that they didn't want out. She was killed. She was buried. All as reporters, we thought, oh, good copy. This is good copy. So we ended up working with one of the psychics who lived locally. Her name was Janine Pace, P-A-C-E. She and her son, Ed, his name was Ed Lake. Janine had divorced. She had been married to a gentleman by the name of Ed Lake. And she and her son, Ed, who she claimed had psychic powers also, agreed to work with John and I. And we were playing with them. We were soaking it up. Again, good copy, fun copy. Evidence, real, who knows? So they took us on a psychic tour, starting at where the newspaper was, Cass Street in Joliet, where the Spectator was. And we drove across the Cass Street Bridge, and we went to Molly's apartment where Molly lived on Buell Avenue. We got out of the car, wandered around. We had the shoes, of course, always had the shoes. And Janine and Ed were kind of wandering around, and they began to sense chloroform and headaches. And they told the tale about how the men were there waiting for Molly when she got home that night. That night being September 25th, 1957, she left the Spectator office after pretty much putting the newspaper to bed. It would go to press the next day. So everything that was planned for that newspaper was already planned. And she left about 11:30. In theory, went straight home, although there was a little debate about that. So the psychics tell us that she was grabbed, thrown into the back of a car, and they drove off. They took her to an apartment complex on Rayner Avenue nearby. This is according to psychics. And questioned her, and they were trying to find out information from her that she was working on. What that information is, don't know. Again, this is psychics talking. They did not get anything from her. According to the psychics, Molly said, "Shove it." They got back in the car, threw Molly in the back of the car, and supposedly hit her over the head, a blow that killed her. This, again, psychics talking. Janine Pace and her son. So we are on this tour, and Janine and her son take us on a ride to Stryker Avenue. Okay? We get out, and Janine and Ed are walking around on Stryker Avenue. Where we're walking was in front of that high rise. I should probably call it a low rise. It's not that high, but I think you know the one I'm talking about. Okay, it's close to Jefferson Street. And they got out and they were wandering around in front of that high rise, that area on Stryker Avenue. And Janine stands on a spot on Stryker Avenue, and she said the following: "She's buried here. I can see her. She's calling to me. She's warning us of danger, but she wants to be found. Dig within 10 feet of this spot, and you will find her. I stake my reputation on it." Okay, this was the psychic Janine Pace saying this. She also told us that day that someone was watching from one of the houses on Stryker. And back in 1957, there were not many of them. She told us there was a witness. Now, again, John and I are sucking this up. It's great copy. And the funny thing about psychics is that, especially as a journalist, is that you don't take what they say as gospel, but there's something inside of you, especially when it's a story that you're working on. The Molly story is a perfect example. There's something inside of you that wants to believe everything they say. You really get sucked into it. And John and I did get sucked into the whole psychic world. It's a dark world for a while until we finally decided we had to get back to facts. But let me share these are from John's notes after that day. And I won't get into the details of what happened that day. I've kind of explained that. But I want to read to you what John wrote, a personal observation after that. He's labeled it Side Observations and Comments. Mrs. Pace started by giving Lonnie a date and a place and asked him what it meant. It was birth date and location of his son's birth. He turned red, I did that a lot, and didn't know what to say. Working with psychics Gene Pace and Ed Lake had a chilling effect upon me. I am frightened of knowing the future, but Molly's story fascinates me. I can't stop now. This is John talking. Following them around an early afternoon at Molly's home and other places didn't bother me that much. However, when we approached the light to turn on Stryker and she said Molly was telling her this was the right place, my backbone felt chilled, nose dry, heart pounding. Then when they pinpointed the location and Mrs. Pace began to talk with Molly, I just stood there and listened. I felt weak but kept snapping photos, especially when she said Molly wanted me to keep after the story no matter who it hurt. She indicated Molly had selected me to finish her work. All along, I felt something was pushing me towards the Molly Zelko story, but I didn't understand it. So those are John's observations. You do get sucked into the psychic world, and he did, and so did I. So, we have a psychic telling us,
Greg.
okay, he was ahead of me. This is Janine Pace and her son Ed Lake. That's me holding a microphone or a tape recorder. It was very windy that day, but I'm really proud to say that waving hair I actually had. Very, very proud of that hair. But that's Janine Pace, and I'm trying to record what she was telling us that day. So, again, we're reporters and it's psychic stuff. How far do you take it? Well, I dove into it. I went to the Joliet library. I pulled out the Joliet City Directory, 1956. I don't believe there was a 57. And I'm going down and looking at a list of the people who lived on Stryker Avenue in 1956. Okay, like I said, there were not many houses there. So I'm going down the list, and then at 103 Stryker Avenue, I see there is a person living there by the name of Ed Lake. And I'm thinking, Ed Lake, that sounds familiar. Oh yeah, that Ed Lake was standing right there. That's the son of Ed Lake. And so I go back to the Herald News, and I go up to John and I said, John, let me show you what I found in the city directory. I think I know who the witness was who saw a body buried in an open ditch on Stryker Avenue on the night of September 25th, 1957. It was her. Okay, are you with me? Our psychic turned out to be our witness. We kept her name anonymous to protect her, and I'll get into that in a little bit. We went to her house to confront her, and her response, soon as it was like she was expecting us, and her basic comment was, I've been waiting 21 years to tell this story. And so we sat down and she told us the story. I'm not going to get into a huge amount of detail of what she told us. Again, it's the basic Molly story. It's in this story. But long story short, it was late, after midnight, closer to 1 a.m. She heard a car pull up, and her window was open. There were sheer curtains, but she could hear outside. She heard a car pull up on Stryker Avenue, and she looked out. She was wondering if it was her husband. She was in a bad marriage. She didn't expect her husband to come home sober anyway, and he didn't that night. But she looked out to see if it was him, and it wasn't. It was a big, large black car with 4 gentlemen in it. They got out of the car, opened the trunk, pulled out what was a body, took it to the nearby ditch and dumped it in head first. She was Janine. Janine was terrified. She urinated on herself that night. She had with her in the bedroom with her dog named Queenie, and she was telling the dog to be quiet. I'll get more into that in a minute. And for the rest of her life, she lived with what she saw and heard that night. So she tells us this story, and she agreed to go under hypnosis twice, where she recounted those details in more detail. I have recordings of the hypnosis, and there are things that are very compelling, besides all the information she shared. She's a small woman, frail, and at the office where she was hypnotized, this was done by Dr. George Haniotis, who some of you might remember. He did this for free to help us with our story, and also to help Janine. Part of her agreement to do this was that the hypnotist would help her get over migraines and some of the trauma that she was still living with because of that night in 1957. She's this frail woman sitting in a large reclining chair, big leather chair, arms, big arms. And as she's talking and she's mentioning the car and the body and the men, she's terrified that they can see her. They know she's there. And you know that she's reliving that fear because on this leather chair, her arm is on this leather chair. And as she begins to tell her story, she's doing this. Okay? You can hear this on the tape. And then as it gets to the body, it's like this. And then that is how it ends up. This woman was terrified all over again. And you could hear it. When the session was over, Dr. Haniotis had made a point to us. He said that you need to understand with hypnosis that a person can lie under hypnosis. They aren't necessarily telling the truth. Okay, keep that in mind. But after the session was over, he just looked at us and he said, well, do you have any doubts? And John and I didn't. And he said that he repeated, a person can lie under hypnosis. But his expert opinion was that on that night, in 1957, she had lived through a very, very traumatic experience. And watching a body being buried outside your window would be traumatic.
You want to hear it?
Yeah. This is from the hypnosis tape. You want to keep playing with it?
You can go ahead.
Okay. Shout at me if you think you can get it. Okay.
Why don't you just continue on?
Okay.
Plug the podcast.
Oh, yeah. If you want to hear what he's trying to play, it is in the podcast. But I can also tell you the content. It's very brief, and she's very frightened because she's reliving the moment.
I figured it out, I'm sorry.
You got it?
You got me hypnotized.
That wasn't it.
We did crazy things. We did seances, and we did a subject factor that we were getting from our sources to this.
Source of the story, Lynn often tagged along with the two reporters on these paranormal.
And he in Joliet, in the night that Molly disciplined a woman who was in her early 20s, living on Stryker Avenue in Joliet. And the night that Molly disappeared, she told us she witnessed the burial of a woman in what was being constructed along Stryker Avenue at the time, which was a storm drainage ditch.
I'm burying it. What are they burying?
The woman who claimed to witness the burial of Molly Zelko the night she disappeared. 20 years after the fact, the woman's memories were understandably hazy. So after their initial interviews, in which Kane and Whiteside deemed her credible, they again revisited their dark world, as Lonnie termed it, of unorthodox means to obtain answers. We should warn you, some of the audio you're about to hear may be disturbing, and per Lonnie's wishes, we've redacted the identity of the witness.
I'm going to record the date of the tape recorder as being Thursday, the 13th of July, 1978. And I'm speaking in the presence of Valley and Lonnie King and John Whiteside. And this is Dr. Honeywood speaking. You continue to relax. What I'd like you to do first is to use your imagination more. I'd like you to imagine you're sitting at a desk, and in front of you there's a calendar.
It's got a long ways to go before you get.
It's one of those special day calendars. It just has the day and the date on it. And this year date, July 13th, 1978. See that? Okay, very good. All I want is to do in your imagination. Flip over a page, the 12th of July, 1978. See that? And 8 and the 7.
We interviewed her. We put her under hypnosis twice. And he had agreed to do this because he was also kind of fascinated by the case. She had migraines in a huge leather reclining chair.
For what? What's the year?
57.
Holy.
27.
You're 27 years old. Okay. Where are you right now?
Sitting in the electrician.
What time is it?
It's 7 o'clock.
7 o'clock in the evening? Or the morning?
7.
Okay. And where is your kitchen?
To the left side of my house.
Okay, I want to ask you some questions. Okay? Alright.
And look out my window.
What's happening?
I see a big black car. Big black. And we go.
Stop the picture. Stop that picture right there. Look at that car.
And these four guys get out, and she describes how they open the trunk and takes out this body that's wrapped in a blanket or a rug or something like that. And they take it and they put it in the ditch. And there's this moment it's on the tape and during the hypnosis where a leg kind of flops out of the blanket, and you can and she says, "It's a body. It's a body."
You're quiet.
Okay, be quiet. What's that? What would make you?
Oh, my God.
What is it?
It's gone.
What are they doing? What are they doing?
Oh, I get down. I was walked around to see how it's looking. We don't know
Kind of hard to hear, but I think you heard the body part, right? And she didn't say it calmly. She was reliving that moment, seeing a body being pulled out of that trunk. In another part of that tape, she's talking to her dog. She's saying, "Queenie, we can't tell nobody, 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 nobody. Don't tell nobody, Queenie." She's talking to her dog. And John asked, "What time is it, Jenny?" And we were referring to her as Jenny on the tape. "It's 1:30, she said. "How do you know, Jenny?" "I looked at my clock on my side of the bed." And then John asked this question: "Are you going to call the police, Jenny?" "No, no, 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 no." Many times no. "Queenie, don't you say nothing." Still the fear. So that was the night. She said that she kind of stayed in a laundry room that night on the floor smoking cigarettes, and she had to clean herself up. The next day, the following day, she had a knock on her door, And it was one of the gentlemen who was in the construction crew working on that. It was not a storm sewer line, I'll explain that a little bit later, but it was a sanitary sewer line that was being installed along Stryker Avenue. And one of the construction crew members came up, knocked on the door, which was not uncommon. They would come and get drinks of water. And I'll talk more about that later too. But his basic comment, according to Janine, was, first out, "How'd you sleep last night?" he asked. And she was a little taken aback, just said, "Fine." And the conversation didn't go on, but the message was clear. To Janine, the message was clear. They knew that she saw what happened. That's how she felt. Whether it was true or not, I don't know. But there are some other things that happened after that. A local grocery supermarket where she had an outstanding bill was paid off by someone. She received a $500 donation that they would give out to needy families. And that Christmas was the best Christmas the kids ever had. The gifts were all donated. More on that later too. Okay, keep in mind at this point in time, she's a 27-year-old mother. She's in this house alone, and she's sleeping with her oldest daughter, Bonnie, age 7, and Eddie, who was a baby, and a younger sister who was a toddler. So 3 children, husband not home. Probably a good thing. Janine passed in October 21st, 2003 at age 73. She lived her life in fear. And I can add more details to that in a moment. But I want to move on to more information. Okay. Repeating here, the psychic that we reported on, who was helping us find Molly Zelko, turned out to be a witness to seeing the body being put into that ditch. Also, let me emphasize that back in 1957, Stryker Avenue was a cow path. It was very thin street, and they were putting that sanitary sewer line in on the west side of the street. That would have been right at the edge of the sidewalk area of her house. So if she was staring at them doing this through shears, she probably thought that they could hear her breathing. They were that close. This is part of the reason why she was terrified. Okay, moving on to what else I want to share today. In November of 2018, I decided I better go and talk to Janine's children. There were only 2 left. Bonnie was one of them. And then someone who had, then Dan Lake, who was not in the house that night. He was not born yet. So I drove to Tennessee to interview the children. My mission was pretty straightforward. I wanted to ask them what they remembered, ask them if they really believed their mother saw a body buried that night on Stryker Avenue. I basically wanted to find out what they knew about the story. Bonnie, the oldest daughter, she was 7 at the time, was detailing, as did her other son Dan, that they truly believed their mother had psychic powers, that their entire family had to live with the fear that their mother had. It was even to the extent that about less than a year after that night on Stryker Avenue, they moved. She went to live with her mother just to get off Stryker Avenue. But according to Bonnie, she had told all her children, she told them, never, ever, ever, ever tell anyone that you lived on Stryker Avenue. And if you can, avoid telling them your last name. So again, she was trying to protect them. So in the conversation, where I'm asking Bonnie to tell me what she remembers, she casually says, oh, I was in the room. I was in the room that night. And I'm thinking, what? You were in the room with your mother that night? Because Janine had told us that everybody, the kids were sleeping, and she was just in there with the dog. And it was the dog she was telling to stay down and be quiet. Now I'm wondering if it was Bonnie she was telling to stay down and be quiet. So Bonnie says she was in the room that night, and her mother was pushing her down, but she said she saw the car, she saw the men, she saw the body. I have the interview transcribed, it's on tape. And I'm glad that I made the trip in 2018 to talk to Bonnie because less than a year later she passed. A freak accident, fell in the shower. Nothing weird other than the weirdness of the accident itself, so she was not a target or anything. I asked them if they remembered the day after, that Christmas. And Bonnie said, oh yeah, I recall that Christmas. I don't know who turned our name in or where it came from, but our living room was full of Christmas presents. I mean, the whole living room. A couple men also came in, took away their Christmas tree, and brought back a bigger, better one. The mother, she said, her mother told them that somebody at the church must have turned in their name, and it came from the church. So here I am coming back from Tennessee, and I've got another witness. 7 years old at the time, but I got another witness. As far as I'm concerned, I've got another witness. Okay, so now we jump to September 25th, magic date, 1986. This is 8 years after our series ran in 1978. And on that day, the Herald News ran a column by John. John kept this story alive, and he frequently wrote about the Molly story on September 25th because it was an anniversary date. In this particular case, it was an anniversary date. It actually ran on the anniversary date, the 25th, 29 years after Molly vanished. In his column, he recapped the basic story, of course, and the details of our witness, and then he wrote this: the story made interesting reading, but nothing happened. No one cared what happened to Molly. No one wanted to dig in the ground to find her. Lonnie and I both felt guilty since then. True. We left the legend hanging there without a conclusion. What will haunt me is what never got into print. Some of that I'm sharing today. The column that John wrote was something journalists do now and then when they have stuff like this, cases like this, a little Hail Mary. You write it, you send it out there, and you hope that it triggers something, a conscience, someone's conscience, and they reach out and share information that becomes valuable. Well, this Hail Mary worked. A couple days after he wrote the column, he got a letter from a gentleman, and his name has never been made public before, and I'll do that now. Gino Julian was his name, Gino Julian. And Gino sat down after reading John's column. He tried to ignore it, but he couldn't. And that night, he wrote a letter to John. And I'm going to read what he wrote to us in part. When the day's work was done on Stryker, I remembered setting out the kerosene lanterns, which we called bombs. So what we have here is a letter from Gino Julian, who worked for the construction company that was putting in the sanitary sewer that night that Janine saw a body thrown in there. We backfilled most all of Stryker that day, except about 50 feet. I asked the foreman about it, and he said, leave it open and put the bombs and barricades around it for safety. Again, these are Gino's words. After we left the job, I wondered why we left the ditch open, being the tile was laid and the risers in. Upon arriving on the job the next morning, I started to pick up the bombs, but found the rest of the ditch filled and the bombs blown out and on the side of the road. Knowing it wasn't backfilled when I left, being the last one to leave the job site, I asked the foreman who backfilled the ditch, knowing the operator and I were entitled extra money for the work done. We were told to forget it. Everything was okay. Being a family man and needing the work, I shut up. Now, John, this is no prank. If it has a meaning in Molly's death, so be it. Trying to watch TV after reading your column, I couldn't get into it, so I thought I would write you. I'm not looking for a story in the paper or any glory. I wanted to write this a few years back, but I didn't want to start more questions. I still don't, but I want it off my chest. If she is buried there, the Lord knows. I was a great admirer of Molly Zelko and the Spectator. She backed down from no one, which I think caused her death or disappearance. The truth is, she told it like it was, no matter what the big shots said. I wish I had a Spectator or two to read back and bring back memories. Being close to retirement, I remain an avid reader of yours and one who will always wonder, is she or isn't she buried at the bottom of Stryker Avenue? So a man who was working on that project, that sanitary sewer project, wrote us a letter and said that that ditch was left open on purpose the night of September 25th, and it was covered up the next morning. After that letter, he wrote another letter, and it's mentioned, he had read a series, actually a friend, he was in Arizona at this time, a friend in Joliet had sent him a series, copy of a 16-part series that John wrote, again on the Molly Zelko case. And this was in 2002. So in 2002, after seeing chapter 5 in the 16-part series, he wrote this to John. Chapter 5 speaks of a woman you called Needle. It was one of the names we gave to protect her identity. Because I remember Needle, and this is interesting, this is Gino talking again. I remember Needle because I stopped by her house when I seen her outside. I told her that something strange happened last night, and in our short conversation, she said she seen some men throw something in the ditch, but did not say anything else. Just to set the record straight, even though it doesn't matter, it was a sanitary ditch, not a storm sewer. That's Gino telling me that. The storm sewer came through the woods off Park Avenue. The contractor who started the job couldn't handle it, so the company that I worked for was awarded it, and we finished it. I have since talked to some of Gino's family, and they confirmed his story. He has told them the similar facts. The similar facts being that he had told his family, he was called off the job that day, came back the next day, it was covered up. Their versions of the story vary a little bit, but it all comes down to the basic fact that that ditch was left open on purpose. His daughter wrote to me, and she repeated her version of the story, which I won't get into now. Again, basic facts are the same. But she also said this, and I want to share this in the letter that she wrote about her father, Gino. He believed with his soul she was buried in the grave he dug. He had the weight of this on his heart and soul for all those years. He said he never feared for himself if he told, as it was the right thing to do, but he wanted to never put his family in harm's way. In fact, it was after his wife passed that he actually told his own family. So right after his love, she says this. So right after his love of 52 years went to meet her God, he told us children that he wrote the letter to Mr. Whiteside. Now, if he had told any of my siblings anything prior to that day, they never said. I will never forget that day. He told us a few more incidents in life that will remain with his children. Good luck in your quest. I hope the truth comes out. So that was from Gino's daughter, who believed that, like her father believed, that there's a strong possibility that there is a body buried in Stryker Avenue. Because of the timing and the date, could very well be Molly Zelko. So, at this point in time, I've got two witnesses to talk about Stryker Avenue, and we have Gino's story. I have also some anecdotal stories that people have shared involving Stryker Avenue. I won't get into those. And I also have a significant bit of other information involving Stryker that I can't share yet. But it adds to the story that Stryker Avenue is a place of interest. Now, I've shared this information with law enforcement and friends and family, and I have to admit that there are times I'm a little overwhelmed by what I've got, and I wonder, do I have anything? Is this really valuable? Is it evidence? Should we be paying attention to it? Should we care? Personally, I can't let it go. I'm obsessed with it as much as John was. Well, I don't know if I could be as obsessed as John was. But it's something that I have to pursue, and I'm not a puppy anymore. I don't have the energy I did when I was 30 years old working on this series. A lot of this information that I'm sharing with you today, I wasn't going to share. I was going to put it into the book I'm working on. I've been working on the book since 2014. And I've learned that when authors say it takes years to write books, they are so correct. And I could say this, if John were here, the book would be done. So I owe an apology to the family and the town of Joliet and anybody that cares about Molly Zelko for not having that done. But I am working on it slowly. But I find that I can't let go of the research. In fact, that I mentioned that I had other significant information about Stryker. That's the result of research that's less than a year old. It's been 65 years, but there are people that still have stories to tell and memories to share and little tiny dots that I'm trying to connect to make the bigger picture true. And they are connecting, for me anyway. So, two witnesses, Gino, and it kind of comes down to this question. Right now it does anyway. And it did in 1978. Although we didn't know about Gino in 1978, and we didn't know about Bonnie in 1978. We just had Janine. But the question hanging is, well, why aren't we digging up Stryker Avenue? Or should we? Well, let me go back to 1978. In 1978, the state's attorney was Ed Pedka. Ed was interested in what we had found. We took to him a copy of the first story that was going to break, Witness. We showed him information from the hypnosis sessions, and we tried to answer all his questions. We did not tell him who Janine was, who the witness was, and he didn't ask, which we were grateful for at the time because we weren't sure how we would deal with it if they were talking about putting us in jail for hiding information. He was interested and even helped us find police reports in the Joliet PD. We had been told by Joliet PD that they couldn't find any reports from 1957. Well, with the help of Ed Pedka, they did find some, not many, but some initial reports, which I still have. He said this, though, the final conclusion. He said, and this was 21 years after Molly disappeared, he said, I am a prosecutor. It's my job to put bad boys in jail, and there's no one to put in jail in the Molly Zelko case. we had no real evidence of who actually killed her, assuming that's what happened. And there would be no one after 21 years likely still around to prosecute, likely. So he said, it's not really something I'm going to spend any money on. There's no way any money's going to come out of the state's attorney's budget to dig up Stryker Avenue. He did make an interesting comment after that, however. He said, and he told us this later, he said, if there had been a public outcry after our stories ran to dig up Stryker Avenue, he would have gotten more involved. He would have been more aggressive. He would have pushed that issue if there had been a public outcry. There wasn't. And I feel partially responsible for that. I didn't own or run the Herald News. But John and I didn't pound our fist on the table with the management there, with the editors, and say, we need to editorialize on this. We need to push the city to dig. We need to pursue this. And we didn't do that. And we didn't have everything I have today, of course. We had one witness, and I'll be honest, part of us thought she was a crazy witness, the psychic thing, you know. But when you listen to her on tape under hypnosis, plus all the other stuff now, looking back, I think she has a great deal of credibility. And if there ever is an effort, which I'll discuss in a moment, to dig up Stryker Avenue, and there is something found there, then she is a hero. So, Ed Petka, 1978, said, not out of my budget, not going to happen unless there's a public outcry. There was not. So, what is happening now? Last year, I did an FOI to check on city records to try and determine whether kind of a history of what work has been done on Stryker Avenue. In other words, could they have been digging up Stryker Avenue at some point in time in the past where they should have found a body if there was one there, or maybe moved it. The records that I have, if I'm interpreting them correctly, and I've been kind of told I have, there has been no significant work, repaving, yes, but no significant work that would go down 7-8 foot into the sanitary sewer line that was put in 1957. So my conclusion is that if somehow they didn't move the body, or there was no body there, then we could still find one. So I reached out after I filed the FOI, and I've got the history of the Stryker Avenue work, but I also got a copy of the original engineering diagrams for the work itself on Stryker Avenue. And I reached out to Jim Trisna, and he's the now retired Public Works Director, and he has been extremely helpful in helping me interpret the drawings, and actually became more involved into what happened next. With his help and background, I reached out to our current state's attorney, Mr. Glasgow. And my hope was that I could get him pumped up to listen to what I've got and maybe help me carry the ball forward. Okay. So again, this is information that I have not made public before, and I'm doing it today. I did reach out to, I had promised his office that at some point in time I would be sharing this. I could have been through something I would write for the paper, the column I work on, or in a venue like this. And I promised I would let them know ahead of time that I was going to talk about what we did. And this week I gave him an opportunity to, if he wanted to make a public statement that I would share today, I would be happy to do that. But I did not hear back, but I only gave him a couple days notice. So that doesn't mean it won't happen down the road. But here's what happened. I was allowed to have a sit-down meeting in his office with his troops around me. I wasn't allowed to tape it. But basically, I gave him a flash drive with everything that I've mentioned today, only in complete detail. That's the audio and the transcripts for the interviews I've done, including the hypnosis back in '78. Everything that I would call evidence that points to Stryker Avenue. So I turned it over to him, and we talked. And after that initial meeting, part of his team members agreed to work with me and talk further about what could possibly be done. So we did have a couple more meetings. Those meetings involved Jim Trisna with the 1957 sketches of the work that was done in Stryker Avenue, and a detective from the Joliet PD. At this point in time, I was very excited. Okay, I'm excited because one, hey, they're listening to me. Two, what I'm calling evidence, they're not laughing at. They're sort of paying attention to it. And three, I'm in a meeting talking about what could possibly be done, and it includes a detective from the Joliet PD. So that excited me. What they decided was that maybe the first step would be what is referred to as the ground radar scan. I've probably someone in this room may have even reached out to me through the Facebook page saying, why don't you do the scan, and save a lot of money, okay? Well, we did a scan. Again, I'm sharing with you for the first time. But don't get too excited. The scan was done on December 14th, so the end of last year. And I apologize for not sharing it with the public before now, but I was actually hoping to share it and then say that we're doing more since then, but I'll get to that in a moment. At that scan on Stryker Avenue, I had to try and rough out an area where the body could potentially be. And it's based on where she lived, and it was kind of a guess. And it's also based on Gino saying that it wasn't the storm sewer, it was a sanitary sewer. So we kind of determined location on that. But we cut a path, a pretty wide path, around that area that's in front of that high rise. That's the area in question. There it is. That's the machine that scans. Okay? And it's like mowing the lawn. He went back and forth one way, and then he went back and forth this way in our target area. The person doing the scan, I really want to give him credit. His name is Sean Ashley, and he's a Midwest area manager for GPRS, ground penetrating radar. They do it for construction companies mostly. And he lives in Will County, and he was very cooperative, very helpful, and did it for free, which excited the state's attorney's office. So, present that day was Jim Trisna. The Zelko family was there, and a detective, not the same detective, because the other detective that had been in our meetings was soon to retire, and also had another gig that day. He had to do an interrogation. But there was another detective there. In fact, it was Kyle Joliet, who actually is a relative of the Zelko family. And also showed up, Jim Glasgow showed up, and one of his deputies and investigators, and the gentleman that had helped set this all up. So some of his troops were there also. So they did this. There's Glasgow there with Jim Trisna. And this, I don't know if you can see this very well, but that's what a scan looks like. Oh, very good. Can you kind of make that out? Isn't that fascinating? So here's what you need to know about scans. And I got this from Sean Ashley. And every time I talk to Sean Ashley, he explained he did it for free because he said, this is a shot in the dark. In other words, there's a strong likelihood that it's not going to produce the results you want, even if there's a body there. And I says, okay, explain this to me. I said, if that scanner goes over a skeleton, can you see that? And he said, no. Okay. And so he had to explain what you do see, and that's it. You see wavy lines that he can interpret, and basically all those wavy lines tell you is if there's some sort of anomaly or disturbance in the pattern of the soil, okay? Well, if Molly's body is there, it's already in an area where the pattern of the soil has been disturbed. It's next to a sanitary sewer line. On top of that, he said, the best I can do with this is 4 foot, maybe 5 feet down. And that's even not counting the difficulty of the soil there. And according to Mr. Trisna, the pipe there, that sanitary sewer line is 7 to 8 foot down. So did a scan, didn't cost us anything, and it didn't show us any anomalies except one, which was in an area only 4 foot down, and it was determined that it was an old culvert for a drainage ditch there. Anybody knows Joliet back in the day, there was a big drainage ditch that went through there. It's been covered up now. Thornton Creek, maybe? In Sean's final report, let me read you in part what it says. Please keep in mind that there are limitations to any subsurface investigation. The equipment may not achieve maximum effectiveness due to soil conditions, above ground obstructions, reinforced concrete, and a variety of other factors. No subsurface investigation or equipment can provide a complete image of what lies below. And I have since talked to other ground radar experts about this situation, and they also said, we could come there and do it. Yes, our equipment's more sophisticated, and they had ground body sniffing dogs also. But they said the only way you're really, because of the situation, sanitary sewer line, et cetera, the only way you're really going to know if there's anything there is to dig. The findings that Sean gave, the subsurface conditions at the time of the scanning allowed for a maximum GPR depth penetration of 3 to 4 feet in most areas. Multiple utilities were observed during the scanning. However, utility locating was not part of the scope of the project. The equipment and methods used did not detect reactions from potential burials. An area of concern was marked out. A retired Village of Joliet employee, that's Jim Trisna, believed that the area marked out as a low point where drainage occurs and believed that an abandoned culvert may exist near our markings. Further investigation may be required, and then that was it. And there was no further investigation. I was hoping for a follow-up meeting with the state's attorney's office, but pretty much the response I got back from the gentleman that was helping us in the office was that we feel that we've probably done as much as we can right now. This ball has to go into the Joliet court because it looks like the only way you're really going to find out anything is to dig, which is probably true. Digging, of course, is an extremely expensive venture. And I don't have an exact cost, and no one has really put together an exact cost because they haven't determined to dig yet. But you have to bear in mind it's more than digging up. It's also repairing what you dug up. Plus, it would have to be treated like a crime scene, I think. And I think the digging would have to be a lot more than a backhoe in the ground. It would have to be a forensic dig where you're sifting sand or whatever's under there. So anyway, that is where I am at today. My mission now is to try to get the Joliet, city of Joliet, interested in at least sitting down and talking about it. A couple weeks ago, knowing that this was coming up, I did reach out and I stopped by the city manager's office. He was not in, and I just left a message asking him to call me. That hasn't happened yet. So I obviously have to be more aggressive, and I apologize to the Zelko family for not pursuing this more aggressively and trying to get the city to say yay or nay. If it comes down to a question, if it comes down to this, yeah, we think that maybe what you've got here is interesting, but we're not going to dig up, we're not going to spend thousands of dollars and cause all that inconvenience on Stryker Avenue just based on what you've got. So, not my call. If they say, if we had the money, we'd do it right away, then I'll jump in. And I might be knocking on your door to make donations. Or if there's somebody who has money in Joliet that wants to front it, let me know. I just think taking a bag of cash to the city would make things a whole lot easier. So anyway, that takes me to where I'm at today in terms of what I'm calling evidence. Call me crazy, but I think it's valid. And I think we have, if we're going to noon, and we can go over if you want. I think I'm going to stop now and to see if anyone has any questions. There's a lot of aspects to the Molly story that we haven't covered today. Jim.
Yeah, Janine talked about seeing a body, what she thought was a body, dumped into a 7-foot deep trench.
Mm-hmm.
And the next morning, it was covered. Who covered? How did she talk about a machine came and pushed dirt in, or 20 guys came with shovels?
Right.
Did she talk about that?
Right. That is a confusing area. Let me point out something about Janine and Gino. You mentioned that Gino, and I mentioned that in his second letter, Gino said he went and talked to Janine and mentioned, and they talked about something happening the night before. Well, Janine, in the time that we spent with her as our witness, she made it perfectly clear that she had some sort of relationship with somebody in that crew, and she wasn't going to tell us who it was. And she referred to somebody by the name of Whitey. That's the closest we got. In our discussions with Gino, he says, well, it wasn't me, I'm no Whitey. But I think that, and especially when family members shared their story, of Gino's story, their version of it, there were little variations to it, suggesting that perhaps Gino was maybe was a little bit more involved in the trenching, and no one ever could tell us who covered it up. I asked Janine the question the next day, and then she says, well, the machine started really early, but she didn't see it. And if she did, she didn't tell us. So I can't answer that question. Did I answer? Okay. Okay.
I just wanted to mention, I did a lot of the statues, well, I did all of the silhouette statues around the city of Joliet and all the way down the I&M Canal. But one of the things I did do in the corner of Western and Center Street is I put the portals of Joliet, which are kind of the outlines of the doorways. But in addition to that, I put Molly Zelko's shoes. So you might want to, if you take a little walk around the cathedral area, you might want to walk by and see Molly's shoes, for whatever reason.
If you go to visit Molly's home, it's on Buell Avenue. Let's see, what is the address? 413. It's 413 Buell. If you go down to the end of the cul-de-sac, the sculpture she's talking about is there too. I have photos of that, which I did not bring today. So.
2, 3, 4.
Go ahead.
Hat.
Okay.
Yeah.
About the shoes, a couple of questions. Number one, where precisely were they found?
Okay.
And second, who were the recipients of her warning about if they take me, my shoes will be there? Were those people ever identified?
Yes. Okay, the question, yeah, I'm sorry, I should have repeated that first question for the audio. The question is, where were the shoes found? And a little more detail on what Molly said about the shoes. I'll try to do this quickly. The next day when Molly left the office that night on September 25th and went home, in theory. After our series ran, we got a call from a gentleman who says he was a bartender at what was back then the Harvard Post, which was a short walk away. And he says that Molly came in that night, got a bunch of quarters, make some long distance calls, and they had like a little phone booth there. So she was inside and she drank 2 scotches, made the calls, and gave him a tip and left. That still would fall, if she did this quickly, that still would fall within the time frame of everything else, probably, give or take 15 minutes. But in theory, she was home sometime between 11:30 and midnight, shortly after 11:30. She did not show up early the next day, which was press day, which was extremely unusual for Molly. They waited a little while. Long story short, they ended up going to her apartment, door locked. Her Chrysler, 55 Chrysler, was parked out in front, and the shoes were there. There was a shoe in the parkway, and there was a shoe on the trunk. The shoe on the trunk was put there by a man who was a bus driver who lived near Onville also, had driven by and saw the shoe. He circled back around, picked up the shoe, and put it on the trunk. The other shoe was in the parkway. They did not find any sign of Molly sleeping in her apartment that night, ever getting into the apartment. So she was either grabbed and taken away, or one of the many other theories, including one theory that she staged the whole thing and took off just to save herself from the threats that she had received. That theory is kind of, if you wanted to connect dots on that theory, it's part of your second part of your question as who she told. She had told friends and family and people at work that, hey, if they get me, and it was kind of a joking thing, because she was warned by the people that loved her to back off, take it easy, chill. And her comment would be, well, if they get me, I'll kick off my shoes, kind of as a joke. But she did this for years. It wasn't just a few months before she disappeared. So if she was building a conspiracy to take off on her own, then she had planned it a long time ago. But that's who she told, okay? Yes, sir?
I'm wondering, since those sanitary sewers are 60 years old, if the city has any future plans on upgrading the system.
When I did my FOI, I don't know if it was FOI or for a news story I saw in the Herald News, but they were doing a survey of potential areas that might need repair. I don't know if there's anyone from the city here that can speak to this, but my understanding is that Stryker Avenue was in like the final phase of that, which was last year, I think, or maybe the year before. But my conversation with city people was that they didn't find any reason to actually dig up that section. Did you want to add something to that?
No, in 57, that's when they started the sewage treatment plant in Joliet. And basically this line, I think, was designed to go there and then go down to the east side treatment plant.
That's true, yeah. It was part of yeah.
In 57.
Right.
Yeah, you, sir.
Did anybody ever question you told him to forget about it? Don't worry about it. It was covered up the next day.
Okay, did we question enforcement-wise? Well, no one in law enforcement knew about Gino. Gino didn't exist to anybody except us, and that was years. We tried to get that from him, and he says, I don't remember his official name. Dog ears is what we called him. And again, God bless Gino and God bless Janine, but there were things in their life that was happening then, and some things that they knew that they did not share. So it's amazing I got what I got. So.
Do you have any idea, this is 57, if they just put her in a blanket or whatever, they didn't embalm her, they didn't put her in a nice little casket? If you're talking about 7 or 8 feet in the ground and after 65 years, does your body, your bones, how long does it take to just go down?
Okay, interesting question. The question is, what was she buried in, and what would the condition of that body be today? Something like that. Not now. Okay. According to Janine, she's not there anymore. The body was wrapped in some kind of, like, I don't want to say rug or tarp, but something like that. And she saw a leg fall out and an arm fall out, and she saw them dump it head first into the ditch. There's some question as to whether or not there was a white powdery substance floating around, as in lime. One of the things that we did back in 1978 is we John interviewed the gentleman who actually created what many people know as the Body Farm. It's in Knoxville, Tennessee, by the university, and it's where they bury bodies and they train FBI and other law enforcement agencies so that they can interpret what they find if they discover a body that's buried. And so they leave bodies buried a long time, or leave them a short time, different levels. So it's basically a lab with bodies. So we talked to the gentleman that created that farm, and this was in 1978. It was 21 years later. But he told us then that if there was a body buried there, if Molly's body was there, 21 years later, there would still be some evidence of it. And I believe that still holds true even though it's 65 years later. It would have to be treated like an archaeological dig. And we also have her dental records on file. And the Zelkos have DNA through Ancestry, I think, that's available that could help if there was a DNA question. So does that answer? My belief is if there was a body there, that there would still be evidence of it.
I'm just saying scientifically, did you ask that question?
Back in 78 we did, yeah.
65 years
Now I have not. So.
If they dug, would they find anything? What happens to the body in 65 years?
Right. So I think the answer would hold true, the same, that if there was evidence there, I mean, they're still finding fossils, but there would be, if there was evidence there, they would find it. But it's not like there'd be a bone jutting up necessarily. So.
We got 5 minutes. Maybe we can. I'll make a couple of acknowledgments. We can ask the family if they want to offer.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, we got about 5 minutes left till the official end of the program, so I'm going to wrap it up by just a couple acknowledgments. Certainly we'll stick around if there's other kind of offline questions we want to discuss. We could talk about it all day, right, and have almost. I do want to acknowledge Lauren is here, and Lynn Lichtenauer, who was our board chair, and we still miss her, passed away about 1.5 years now. Lynn introduced this to even John Whiteside, was credited as that on kind of the late night hangout when they were neighbors. Lynn is in the podcast, and certainly if you haven't heard it, listen to her talk not only about this, but about Joliet and her memories. And so definitely we're thinking about her today. She would have loved to be here and loved that there was this much interest and attention. And Dennis, Mr. Dennis Henrietta, if you haven't listened to the podcast, this guy's a walking encyclopedia of mafia knowledge, and that was really sort of the difficulty with framing this. To know this, you have to know this individual and this entity and how these two things were connected. And as we say in the podcast, that business, government, organized labor, it was very murky. It was a lot foggier, those relationships, than we have today with the internet and social media. So I do want to invite the family one more time. If there's anyone from the family who would like to kind of say anything else before we close out, Jim or anyone. And I want to thank you for being here. I'm sure it's still difficult to hear about some of this stuff 65 years later for one of your family members. So I think everyone here, their heart is in the right place. We want this solved. It needs to be solved. And again, that Molly has certainly become larger than life, but this is an important thing, and really I feel historically important. And finally, Lonnie, thank you. I mean, Lonnie has really put himself into this story. And I think at the end of the day, we have a confession. We have someone who confessed to this, and if you're not overly familiar with the story, you had meaningful involvement from J. Edgar Hoover, who was writing detailed air tells following this case. You had Bobby Kennedy involved in this case. So it may not be a question of who knows what on the street. It may be a question of who knows what inside the government. Jimmy Arini was interviewed, was put before the Rackets Committee exhaustively, so I think there's something there, and we won't get into that thread, but someone knows something, and that's what I'm convinced of, so we need to find that something in someone wherever it is. So Lonnie, I'll let you have the final word here.
Okay. I want one more question. You seem real excited.
Just a little quick tidbit. J.P. Rasmussen, lifelong resident of Joliet, grew up in the Curry house. My father bought it from Frank Curry in 1971. My mom sold it in 2001. I was 2 years old when we moved in there. 28 or 30 when we moved out, but I lived my life growing up in that house. house. A lot of history, a lot of talk of this over the years. Our house was on TV back in the 80s when they thought she was their front porch. So it's called house, hey, your house is on TV. Just wanted to add that to the mix. Bittersweet thing to grow up around and hear the stories and the walls can talk.
Yeah, the house was originally built by Gerlach. In fact, the doorknob still has a big G on it in the front. Yeah. So, and he's the guy that ran the big calendar company in town.
We had the privilege about 3 or 4 years ago to walk through the house again.
Oh. Yeah. The last time I was in there, the artwork was still on the walls. And, yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
I'm Dr. George Honeyos. I wrestled for Joliet West in high school, and he joined the wrestling team about 1975 and became our team physician hypnotist. And we were required, if we wrestled first rate, everyone was required to go to him for a half an hour a week during the season. And I sat in that leather chair.
Okay.
So I know what goes on there. And I don't know anything about hypnotists per se, except my own experience and what it meant to us. We've never lost a wrestling match for 4 years. We have the Illinois state record, 81-0. We set 4 records in Illinois. And that man is the reason why Joliet West was so successful at wrestling. I don't know what he did that night, but I was part of his life at that time. And I know what he did to me and my teammates, and it was real. I just wanted to add that.
He did a wonderful job for us and was very helpful and didn't charge.
Okay, so again, I think maybe we'll kind of take it offline. If we want to invite you to view these incredible artifacts over here. I also want to thank the museum staff. We all kind of threw this together last minute, especially your curator, Stephen, who put this exhibit literally this morning. So fine job as always. And the rest of the museum staff, thank you much. Lonnie, anything else before we go?
I want to make one final point. You can go to the Facebook page, the Molly Facebook page, or I have an email that's at the bottom of the column that's in the paper every Saturday. So if anybody has any questions or wants to talk more or share a Molly story with me, that's how you can do it. Please do. Thank you for being here. Yeah. Yes, you did.
Excuse me. Were you the man who got up and talked? Ma'am. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh. Did you get up and say something? What?